I was never a church-going man, you know? To me, God was just something people made up to cope with how hard life can be. As a truck driver, my faith was in the asphalt, in the rumble of the engine, and in the freedom to go wherever I wanted. But looking back now, I realized that freedom was just a mask for the emptiness I carried inside. That night, driving under a storm that looked ready to swallow the world, I felt something different. Like life itself was demanding a purpose I'd never bothered to look for. It was just me, the truck, and the road, but deep down, maybe Jesus had already been there watching me. The storm came with a force I'd never seen before. The sky was falling apart with lightning and thunder, and the wipers couldn't keep up with the rain. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my hands hurt, trying to keep control as the truck slid across the slick asphalt. I'd always thought I could handle anything, that I didn't need anyone, least of all a miracle. But in that moment, a different kind of fear took over me. It wasn't just the fear of crashing. It felt like I was facing something bigger, something that made me question who I really was. The loneliness of the road had always been my companion, but that night it felt heavier. I thought about my life, the choices I made, the times I laughed at people who talked about faith. What for? I used to say, life is what you make of it. But there, in the middle of the storm, I started to feel a tightness in my chest, like something was calling me to look beyond what I could see. It wasn't just the storm outside. There was a storm inside me too, tearing apart everything I thought I knew. Maybe it was God's presence, but stubborn as I wasn't ready to admit it. As the truck cut through the rain, memories I'd buried started to surface. The sound of my mother's voice talking about Jesus, promises I made and never kept, the emptiness I covered up with jokes and beer. I didn't want to think about any of it, but it was like the rain was washing away all the lies I'd told myself. Then, suddenly, the truck skidded. The wheel slipped from my hands and the world spun. The cliff was just ahead, only a few meters away, and I knew there was no way out. My heart pounded so fast it felt like it would burst, and for the first time, I screamed for help. I didn't even know who I was calling to, but I screamed. And in that chaos, something happened. The truck was still spinning, but I felt a calm I couldn't explain. It was as if an invisible force had taken hold, like time itself had stopped. Ahead of the truck, I saw a man. I couldn't see him clearly through the rain, but his eyes, my God, those eyes were so peaceful, so full of light, they made my chest feel warm. "You still have a road to follow," said a voice, not from outside, but from within me. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was deliverance, something that would change my life forever. And then, everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, the truck was stopped, tilted on the edge of the road, with the cliff just inches from the front wheel. My heart was still racing, but I was alive, when everything said I shouldn't be. There was no logical explanation. The truck hadn't flipped, hadn't fallen, and I didn't have a single scratch. A shiver ran down my spine, like God himself was there, whispering that this was a miracle. But stubborn as ever, I still tried to convince myself it was just luck. I stepped out of the truck, trembling, the rain soaking through my clothes, the cold wind cutting into my skin. I looked over the cliff, so deep I couldn't see the bottom, and my stomach churned. How did I survive that? I remembered the man I saw, that calm gaze that seemed to look right into my soul. "You still have a road to follow." The words echoed in my mind, and I didn't know if it was memory or something still speaking to me. For the first time, I felt like maybe Jesus was more than just a story, but admitting that shook everything I believed. I sat on the hood of the truck, trying to calm down as the rain began to fade. I thought about my life, the nights I spent running from myself, thinking the open road could fill the emptiness. But there, on the edge of that cliff, I started to wonder, what if that deliverance was a sign? What if there was a greater purpose for me, something I'd never wanted to see? My head was spinning, not just from the scare, but because something inside me was beginning to change, even if I was still fighting it. I tried to start the truck, but it wouldn't turn over. So I just sat there, in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by silence. That's when I noticed a small wooden cross planted by the side of the road, probably for someone who hadn't been as lucky as me. That cross made me think of Jesus, and of what my mother used to say about him always being near, even when we don't believe. I didn't know how to pray, but I mumbled something like, "If that was you, thank you." It wasn't much, but it was honest, and deep down, I knew that moment was changing me. While I waited for help, I started remembering other moments when I'd felt something strange, times I'd been spared without reason, coincidences that suddenly didn't feel so random. The rain stopped, and a faint moonlight shone over the road, like it was showing me the path was still open. I didn't understand what was happening, but one thing was clear: that miracle on the highway had sparked something, a flicker of faith inside me. But before I could process it all, I saw headlights approaching. Someone was coming, and somehow, I felt like their arrival was part of the plan too. The headlights cut through the darkness, and an old car pulled up beside my truck. A man got out, calm, almost as if he already knew what I'd been through. He asked if I was all right, and still shaking, I told him what happened: the skid, the cliff, the voice I'd heard. He smiled, like he understood something I didn't yet, and said, "Sometimes, Jesus puts us back on the right road when he knows it's time." Those words hit me deep, like God himself was standing there in that stranger, making me see everything in a new light. He offered to help me call a tow truck, but before that, he sat with me by the side of the road. He started talking about faith, about how he himself had once been spared years ago. I, who used to make fun of stories like that, stayed quiet, just listening. Every word he spoke seemed to light something inside me, like that miracle on the road wasn't just to save me from the cliff, but to show me there was a greater purpose. For the first time, I didn't feel like arguing. I just wanted to listen, to try and understand what was changing inside me. While we waited, he pulled a small Bible from his pocket and read a passage about how God never abandons those who seek him. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to laugh like I always did, but another part, a part one didn't even know existed, was curious. He didn't pressure me. He just said, "Sometimes, change starts with a scare, but it's your heart that decides to follow." Those words kept echoing in my mind, as if Jesus himself was calling me, even though I was the guy who never believed in him. The tow truck arrived, and the man shook my hand firmly, with a look that seemed to see right through me. He told me to keep searching, as if he knew my journey was only beginning. When my truck was taken away, I was alone again, but now, the weight in my chest felt different. It wasn't fear anymore, it was a mix of doubt and hope. I looked at the cross by the side of the road and felt that this wasn't the end, it was the beginning of something. My life, which had always seemed so clear, now felt full of questions I needed to answer. I climbed into the tow driver's truck, still thinking about that stranger and his words. He had spoken about Jesus with a certainty I'd never seen before, and it bothered me, but it also drew me in. As we drove down the road, I saw a small church in the distance, a soft light glowing through one of the windows. Something inside me whispered that I needed to go there, even if only to understand what was happening to me. It wasn't a decision, it was an impulse, as if the faith I'd always rejected was now pulling me toward a new path. And for the first time, I didn't want to resist. When I got out of the tow truck, my eyes stayed fixed on that small church, the gentle light shining through the window. Something inside me, maybe God's presence, was drawing me there, like an invitation I couldn't ignore. I, who used to laugh at people who talked about Jesus, stood there hesitating, yet filled with a new desire to understand what that miracle on the road really meant. My feet felt heavier than usual, but I took the first step, realizing that every meter toward that door was a life change I didn't even know I wanted. It was as if the miracle that night had cracked open a door in my heart, and now I had to decide whether to step through it. Inside the church, the silence felt different. It wasn't empty, it was comforting. An older woman with a kind smile noticed me standing there and asked if I needed anything. I told her, a bit clumsily, about the storm, the cliff, the voice I'd heard. She listened carefully, as if she'd heard stories like mine before, and said, "Sometimes, Jesus finds us in the middle of chaos to show us the way." Her words echoed what the stranger on the road had said, and I felt a shiver down my spine, as if faith was finally starting to make sense, even though I was still fighting it. I sat on a bench in the back, looking at the candles and the crucifix on the wall. For the first time, I didn't see it as some silly decoration, but as a symbol of something greater. I started thinking about what my mother used to tell me as a kid, that God never gives up on anyone, not even the stubborn ones like me. That night, that deliverance, couldn't have been a coincidence. It was as if Jesus had placed every piece perfectly to bring me there. But I'll admit, there was still a part of me resisting, wanting to go back to the old life where I believed in nothing. The woman offered me a cup of coffee and began sharing her own story, how she'd found her purpose after years of being lost. She spoke with such conviction that I caught myself wondering what it would feel like to have that kind of certainty. For the first time, I asked myself, what if the change I needed wasn't about fixing my truck or finding a new job, but about changing who I was inside? I didn't know how to pray, but as I held the warm cup in my hands, I whispered a quiet, "Thank you, Jesus." It was small, but it was a start, and my heart felt lighter. When I stepped out of the church, the night was clear, as if the storm had never happened. I looked up at the sky, and one star shone brighter than the rest, almost as if pointing the way. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I felt that moment in the church had marked me somehow. The tow driver had told me the truck would be ready in a few days, and I'd have to decide what to do until then. Something told me the road, which had always been my home, would now lead me somewhere new, not just to another place, but somewhere deeper inside myself. And for the first time, I was curious to see where that path would take me. The following days felt strange, like I was living between two worlds. During the day, I dealt with fixing the truck, but at night, my mind kept drifting back to that church, to the cross on the roadside, to the voice I'd heard. I, who had always thought faith was for the weak, started feeling a kind of emptiness that could only be explained by one thing. God's presence was calling me. It wasn't just about surviving that storm anymore. It was as if Jesus was inviting me to understand the purpose behind that night. So, I decided to return to the church, even with my heart full of doubts. When I got there, the same woman greeted me as if she'd known me for years. She handed me a Bible and said, "Read with an open heart, and He will speak to you." I opened the book awkwardly, but the words seemed to leap off the page, telling a story that felt like my own. I read about miracles, about men who, like me, had doubted until they were touched by something greater. For the first time, I realized the transformation I needed wasn't just about escaping the cliff, it was about finding a new road, one that truly made sense to my heart. As I read, I started talking to others in the church. Simple people, each with their own ups and downs, but all with a kind of faith that shone in their eyes. One man, a former truck driver like me, told me how Jesus changed his life after an accident much like mine. He said that sometimes a miracle isn't just meant to save your body, it's meant to save your soul. That struck a chord deep inside me because I knew the miracle that night wasn't the end of the story, it was the beginning of something I still needed to understand. My stubbornness kept fighting it, but the seed of faith had already been planted. I spent hours thinking about what had happened on the road. Sometimes I closed my eyes and saw that man with the calm eyes, as if he were still there, guiding me. I started praying, awkwardly of course, but with real intent. I asked to understand what Jesus wanted from me, why He had saved me. Each prayer felt like a small step, but every one made me feel lighter, more connected to something greater. I began to realize that the change I'd always thought impossible was actually happening, not because I was strong, but because something stronger was holding me up. When the truck was finally ready, I knew I'd soon be back on the road. But now, something was different. I didn't just want to drive aimlessly anymore. That night in the storm, that miracle, had lit a flame inside me, a curiosity about who I could become if I accepted that calling. As I packed my things, I found the Bible the woman at the church had given me, with a note inside, "Trust in Him, and the road will open." I felt warmth spread through my chest, as if Jesus Himself was telling me the next stretch of my journey was coming, and that I needed to be ready to follow. I hit the road again with my truck repaired, but something in me was no longer the same. The rumble of the engine, the asphalt rushing beneath the tires, it all felt familiar, yet I saw everything differently. Every mile reminded me of that miracle, of the voice that told me I still had a road to follow. For the first time, I felt that Jesus was with me, not as a distant idea, but as a real presence of God that filled my heart. The road, which had always been my escape, now felt like an invitation to discover the purpose he had for me. I carried the Bible I'd been given, and during stops, I'd open it carefully, like someone exploring a new map. I read about men who, like me, had doubted until they were transformed by a miracle. Each verse seemed to speak directly to me, as if Jesus knew every corner of my heart. On quiet nights, I prayed, still clumsy, but with a faith that grew a little stronger each day. It was as if that storm had washed away the tough shell I'd built around myself, leaving room for a kind of change I never thought possible. At truck stops, I started sharing my story. At first, it was just a comment here or there, but soon I noticed others listening closely. One fellow driver, who'd narrowly survived an accident himself, said my story made him think about God for the first time in years. That hit me hard. What if my miracle wasn't just for me, but to reach others too? I began to feel that my transformation had a greater purpose, as if Jesus was using me to bring hope to people who, like me, had given up on believing. Of course, there were still moments of doubt. Sometimes I looked out at the horizon and wondered if it was all just in my head. But then I'd remember that calm gaze, that voice in the storm, and my faith would return, stronger than before. I started doing small things differently, helping a fellow trucker with a flat tire, listening to someone who needed to vent, even offering a prayer when someone seemed lost. It was as if God's presence was guiding me, not just on the road, but in every action, every conversation. One night, I stopped at a simple gas station under a sky full of stars that seemed endless. As I sipped my coffee, I felt a peace I couldn't explain. I looked at the small cross hanging from my rearview mirror, a gift from another driver, and smiled. The road was still my home, but now I knew I wasn't traveling alone. Something inside me whispered that the next stop would bring more answers, maybe even a new calling. I didn't know what was ahead, but for the first time, I was ready to follow the path Jesus was laying before me. The road was still the same, with its bumps, curves, and long stretches, but I wasn't the same man anymore. Every trip now felt like a chance to feel God's presence, as if Jesus himself was beside me, guiding every mile. The miracle from that stormy night wasn't just a memory, it was a turning point that split my life into before and after. I started to realize that faith, the very thing I once rejected, was now what gave me strength to face each day. My transformation wasn't just about believing, it was about living with a purpose I never knew I could have. At my stops, I began speaking more openly about the miracle I'd experienced. Truckers, waitresses, gas station clerks, they all listened with curiosity, some with tears in their eyes. One day, a young guy who looked as lost as I once was asked me to pray for him. Me, someone who barely knew how to pray, held his hand and asked Jesus to guide him. When he smiled and thanked me, I realized my transformation was serving a greater purpose. It was as if the miracle I'd received had been a seed, one meant to grow in the lives of others. I started keeping small Bible booklets in my truck, handing them out to anyone who wanted one. Not to force anything, but to share what was changing me. I remembered the woman from the church, the stranger on the road, and I understood that they'd been God's instruments to show me the way. Now, I wanted to be that for someone else. Faith, once just an empty word to me, had become the foundation of my life. Every time I looked at the horizon, I'd think, Jesus, what else do you have for me? And somehow, I knew he was answering. There were still hard days. The road isn't easy, and neither is life. But whenever doubt crept in, I remembered that calm look in the storm, the voice that told me I had a road to follow. That gave me strength to keep going, to keep seeking a transformation that never stopped. I started dreaming new dreams, maybe helping other truckers find hope, maybe even speaking in churches about what I'd lived through. The purpose Jesus had placed in my heart was growing, and I wanted to live for it. One evening, I stopped at a rest area and watched a sunset that painted the sky with colors I'd never noticed before. I picked up my Bible, read a verse about trusting in God, and felt a peace I wouldn't trade for anything. The road was still my home, but now I knew it led somewhere far greater. As I packed my things, I noticed a new truck driver sitting alone, looking lost. Something told me it was time to share my story again, to talk about the miracle that had changed everything. I didn't know how he'd react, but I felt Jesus calling me to take the next step. Part superior do formulario. Part inferior do formulario.